spaceflight. It all started a long, long time ago in China. These early rockets were used as weapons for show. Yes, that means fireworks are early rocket science. The evolution of rocket technology has been led by wars, but more importantly has resulted in space travel. So if you hold a bottle rocket in your hand, light it, you can lift off into the deep abyss. No, because if that were true, I would be blown up. Realistically, we need a much larger rocket and an ocean of fuel. So fireworks are fun, rocket science has come a long way since then. Not so long ago, in the late 1950s and 60s, people first saw essentially two countries engaged in a technological arms race, known as the space race today. This period, following World War II, began when Russia successfully launched the first satellite into orbit. In response, the United States started the Mercury program, which was a one-person shuttle that was restricted to orbital missions around the Earth. Clearly, that was not enough for the U.S. As always, we wanted bigger and better. President Kennedy decided to place space exploration at the highest level of national priority.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This gave birth to the world-famous Apollo program, the sole mission to place humans on the moon, in which NASA, on behalf of the U.S., successfully completed on July 20th, 1969.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Let's take a step back for a moment. It's important to note a key reason for the creation of the Apollo program, the one-in-a-kind political environment in which it was created. The space race was not a time of peaceful, friendly competition for either countries involved. There was immense political pressure during the Cold War to gain technological superiority between the U.S. and USSR, along with the military desire for control over space for national defense. The notion of the USSR gaining control of space, which could ultimately lead to a leg up on espionage, provided a perceived threat for the U.S. government. The perceived threat is argued to be an extremely important motivation for both the political and national interests tied with the creation, operation, and support of such an expensive project. Therefore, many historians label the launch of the U.S. space program as a political Cold War maneuver, as opposed to a simple desire for space exploration.
Now, this pressure ended up being good. The Apollo mission has been discussed as one of the greatest technological achievements in human history. Many technological advances have been credited to this program. The in-flight computer design used in the command and lunar modules has been noticed for influencing early research in integrated circuits.
Even the origins of basic consumer products like Velcro, flame-resistant textiles, and quartz crystal clocks are closely linked to research and development during the Apollo mission. Still, none of these made up for the massive costs of the mission themselves. Now let's get back to the big picture. Going to another terrestrial body. How in the world can you do that? Easy answer, rocket science. Move on from Mercury rockets, and we have the massive Saturn V. Building these rockets and successfully launching them with not one, but 3 astronauts was not an out-of-pocket expense, or a typical job for the average Joe. The overall cost of the program was $23 billion during its actual time of operation, or about $170 billion in 2005 dollars. This includes R&D costs, acquirement of 15 Saturn V rockets, 16 command and service modules, 12 lunar modules, program support, and management costs, construction expenses, and costs for flight operations. NASA's portion of the federal budget was indeed greatest during the Apollo missions, reaching its peak funding in 1966 with a total of 4.41% of the total budget. This percentage has been under 1% since 1974. This large percentage is reflected in the number of staff working for NASA. In 1965, NASA hired its peak number of employees, 411,000. Since then, the organization has not hired more than 50,000. At the end of the Apollo program, NASA started seeing drastic budget cuts. Suddenly, spending several billion dollars per launch vehicle just wasn't practical. There was also a strong push not to simply discard the majority of the rocket during each mission, as suddenly Earth's orbit was becoming akin to the streets of a big city without garbage collection, if said garbage was traveling fast enough to tear a hole in solid steel. In this regard, the space shuttle was born, a vehicle capable of delivering both a large payload and crew to low Earth orbit, with only one component, the gigantic external fuel tank, that was discarded to a fiery death in the atmosphere. On paper, this sounds futuristic and cost-effective, but once you add the cost of ground support, assembly, fuel, construction, design, and other associated costs, the shuttle cost NASA $1.45 billion, which might sound like a lot of money, since it's only $100 million less than the cost of Burj Khalifa, or about two-thirds the cost of a single V-2 bomber. So space is expensive, and when you consider the number of engineers and scientists behind it, and the fact that everything in space is hostile to human life and technology, this cost starts to make sense. Nonetheless, this is a significant investment. So why do we do it? Well, the clearest example fits in the palm of my hand. A smartphone simply wouldn't be possible without the benefit of satellites. Phone calls, cell data, both use satellites to relay information across the world far more effectively than through wires and radio towers. Or what about maps? Back in ancient times, before the GPS, humanity had to hunt with only a map to find where they are and where they're going. Now we simply pull out our phones and ask Google to find our location. So what do these modern conveniences have in common? They all have their origins in military-funded projects that were later adapted to civilian use. In fact, until recently, exploration and exploitation was almost entirely a government affair. While companies such as Boeing and Lockheed Martin have done extensive work on rockets and satellites, their efforts are almost entirely funded by government contracts. Clearly then, there is a small issue with private space companies, and that if you only have one customer, even with that customer has a lot of money to spend, profits are going to be harder to come by. But what if the price to put a payload in orbit was affordable to more people? This is the model companies such as SpaceX and Virgin Galactic have based their programs on. So what should you expect in the coming years? It's hard to pin anything down as certain, but there are some things that we are pretty sure about. Barge landings, for instance, could become the norm for reusable spacecraft, assuming, of course, it actually works. Ignoring the technical difficulties, this would make reusable spacecraft recoverable and therefore cheaper when compared to your standard single-use rocket. CubeSats would also be a unique way to build cost-efficient rocketry. Instead of launching a single large orbiter or satellite with a specific mission, we could instead send a group of small cubes in a single blast. Well, they don't get much bigger than a desktop computer, costing around $10,000 to build and $100,000 to launch. It would allow us to cheaply get into space, even if the functions are limited. If costs continue to go down and we can manage to get outside of Earth's gravity well, we could get a wider scope of data that could be achieved with a single large-scale mission. We would be getting some data from everywhere, instead of very specific data from a single location. Due to their low cost, many schools and universities are funding CubeSat launches, even here at CU. Small space companies are catching the attention of larger companies that are not in the industry, such as Google, which bought out the startup company Skybox. Everyone believes space companies need hundreds of millions of dollars to succeed, but scrappy startups, such as Skybox, prove that wrong. The big space agencies are still going to be around, even if commercial companies are increasing their influence on space exploration. The European Space Agency has recently placed a small lander on an asteroid, and the Chinese Space Agency recently did the first soft landing on the moon since 1976. NASA has long-term plans to redirect an asteroid and capture it in lunar orbit, and long-term plans to put humans on Mars. All of the companies and agencies adding new jobs and cash flow into the economy, pushing further for space travel, would have had difficulty coming to rise without the granddaddy program, Apollo. Apollo simply made space travel a reality more than a dream. If we as humans wish to discover and explore the mysteries of space, we need to develop our space technology to survive the cosmos. If it is a push for survival that would have remained unmasked without the Apollo